Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, welcome to the Better Sex Podcast. I'm Jessa. I'm here again, bringing another episode because I feel like sex is really important and I want to make a difference in your intimate relationship. So I hope you're enjoying the show. I would love to hear from you if you are. Actually, I'd love to hear from you if you aren't, too. If you have ideas about what you would like to learn or hear about on the show, please share them with me. You can email me at change, CHANGE, at jessazimmerman.com. You can also record a question on bettersexpodcast.com. There is a little microphone icon and widget on the site that allows you to actually record a question. And if you do that, I might use it on the show. I might answer it anonymously. So I'd love to have those questions come through that way also. A couple other ways you could get involved, just so you know. I'm always looking for people to come on the show and share their personal stories around their challenges or their journey around sex. I do that anonymously. So get in touch if you're interested in sharing your story. I think it's a really impactful way for people to realize they're not alone out there with their struggles. And the other thing I would invite you to do is to join me as what's called a Patreon. It's sort of like an NPR pledge. You can become a Patreon on patreon.com. There's links on the podcast website for this. It allows you to make just a small monthly pledge, which supports the show, right? It goes to the costs of editing and promoting the show. And for even just $2 a month, a tiny amount, way less than a cup of coffee, you get advanced access to every episode. And there's a little bit different kinds of rewards for a little bit more contribution, but even a very small contribution helps. So I'd love to have your support. Today's episode is another one of what I'm calling my soapbox shows, where I get to climb up on my soapbox and talk about something that I personally think is really important about sex. So today's episode is about our expectations and how they do not help us. We have ideas about how sex should go, what it should look like, what we should be doing, and those ideas are mostly unhelpful. That's what sets us up to feel badly about our sex life. So that's the topic for today's show, and I hope you enjoy it. So I recorded a previous episode, I think it's number 40, actually, of this podcast, talking all about the sexual avoidance cycle. And this is a trap that I see so many couples fall into. It's a circle of disappointment with sex, where it seems to go badly, which leads to avoidance of sex or even talking about it, which increases the pressure around sex in a relationship, which makes it that much harder to have a fulfilling encounter, which gets you back to disappointment, right? So that episode, I talked all about that cycle and the stages of it, kind of laying that out for you. Whether or not you've heard that episode, I mean, certainly you can go back and listen. But I wanted to dig in to the disappointment phase of the cycle, because that is all about our expectations. So basically, I mean, I'll put it this way. Your expectations are the problem. It's possible to change our expectations to make them realistic and grounded in such a way that we actually cannot fail at sex, where you could banish disappointment. I mean, I know that's a big promise, but I actually believe that. So in today's episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the kinds of things that influence our expectations that we need to examine. I'm also going to take apart the most common myths that I see about sex that basically create unrealistic expectations, which again, set us up for feelings of failure, right? That's what's going to leave us feeling bad about the sex that we're having. So if we're going to examine our sexual expectations, you need to think about how your family history, how your culture and social environment, and your experiences, your sexual experiences, have shaped what you expect about sex. Because, we're all raised in a family and in a neighborhood or city or something, some social group, potentially with religious influences and cultural influences of all of that have a lot to teach us about sex. And, you may not have examined that or thought very much about that, but if you really think about the kinds of messages you got about sex, and I'm talking, explicit messages, things people said to you, and more, like implicit, what was conveyed even without words? What was modeled for you, in your home or in your community or in your peer group? I mean, just think about it. By the time you were becoming a sexual person, how were you feeling about sex? Were you thinking, this is amazing. I can't wait to explore this. How exciting. This is, best thing since sliced bread. Were you thinking this is totally scary and unknown and mysterious and I feel apprehensive? Were you feeling this is shameful, dirty, sinful, bad? And those aren't the only options, of course, but it says a lot by the time you're sort of a teenager-ish, and you're starting to think of yourself or become aware of yourself as a sexual person. What were you thinking and feeling about it? That will give you at least a starting point of how much you have been influenced by your environment. So I recommend giving a little bit of thought to exactly what those messages were and how you internalize them. Because, it's been said that no two kids have the same parents. So even, you and your siblings, if you have any, would have internalized this differently, integrated it differently. So you really have to look at your unique way of handling the messages you got. Because some of you, luckily, were able to shake off some of the messages. I mean, like, sure, your church told you one thing, but you didn't buy it, or your parents projected a certain attitude about sex, but you didn't take that on, right? So lucky for you if you were able to shake that off. But many of us have to kind of examine this and shed this as adults. So that's an important thing to look at. Another thing you really have to consider when you're thinking about your expectations about sex is pornography. I mean, this is ubiquitous these days, right? I mean, maybe some of you haven't seen it, although I think that's probably unlikely, but you will have at least heard of it and maybe imagined what's in there. But pornography is everywhere now. And I'm not going to get into a conversation about the morality of porn at this point. I just want to talk about it as it pertains to us learning about sex or thinking that we're learning about sex and how much it can shape our expectations. So pornography is not sex. It is fantasy. It is entertainment. It is scripted and produced and manipulated to emphasize certain aspects of sex. So, pornography is divided into like zillions of different categories, all of which emphasize a certain aspect of eroticism. So like anything that's out there is going to be erotic to at least some sliver of the population. That's why it's there, right? There are people that respond to it. But in that way, it's basically it's a caricature of sex, right? If you've ever seen one of those drawings that overemphasize the nose or the eyes or whatever, that's what porn is, right? It overemphasizes a certain aspect of eroticism. So it's this caricature. It's not actual sex. Now, I mean, there are some amateur videos that are put up by just sort of regular people, and I suppose that's showing sex, but even then there's a camera. But most of it is really artificial. And so people that think they're learning about sex from watching porn are grossly misinformed. And it's affecting what people think sex looks like. It affects what we expect of bodies for both men and women, right? These are sort of often exceptional physical attributes that we're dealing with, not realistic, right? It's affecting how we think sex happens between two people or how it's negotiated. Generally it's missing sort of any sort of consent or agreements that are visible to the viewing audience. It's affecting what kind of acts, behaviors, sexual acts that we think people are going to automatically be interested in. Some people are, but some aren't, right? It has all these influences on how we think sex is supposed to go. And then there's things that are seen like, it seems like people can have sex forever, or it seems that drives me crazy that women are going to orgasm through penetrative sex, or that everybody's supposed to be squirting. There's all this stuff we see in porn that gives us this really unbalanced view of what really happens. So it's worth thinking about your viewership of pornography and how that may have influenced what you expect for sex with a partner. Okay, if you can separate those things, great. But if you've struggled with that, if you expect sex at all to be mimicking porn, you really may have to take that apart and think about how has this shaped what I'm thinking and what I'm doing with a partner and what I'm thinking should be happening, because that really can set you up to feel like you're failing anyway. The other thing I wanted to talk about in regards to expectations are these sexual myths. And this is not going to be a complete list of all the sexual myths that are out there, of course, but these are the ones that I see most frequently in my practice with couples, right? So these are the ones that show up for a lot of people, and they don't understand that they're myths. Right? So they have these unrealistic expectations, which again sets them up to feel like they're failing, either that they're broken or their partner's broken, or, they're really afraid that I'm just in the wrong relationship. If sex isn't working the way I think it should, maybe I'm just wrong with the wrong person, which is a heartbreaking thing to think if you're in love with each other. So I'm going to cover some of these myths and talk about each one in some detail. So the first myth I'm going to tackle is the idea that you and your partner should want to have the same amount of sex. Okay, that's a myth. In every relationship, one person wants more sex than the other, at least over time, right? It may not feel like that in the beginning, but eventually somebody's going to want more sex than the other person by at least a little bit. Think about it. It makes sense, right? Why would any two people want exactly the same amount of sex? Except that tends to be our expectation. So that desire discrepancy is totally normal. Okay, there's not something broken with that. Now, I'm going to talk on another podcast at some point about how to handle desire discrepancy, because plenty of people fall into sort of traps with it, and it becomes problematic because of how they're handling it. And sometimes just because of the expectation that this shouldn't be a problem. But everybody's going to have a desire discrepancy over time. It's also important to keep in mind that it might switch. Which one of you wants more sex can change over the course of your relationship. None of that is broken. That's how it works. But if you have this idea that we should both want sex as much as the other person, then you're not prepared to handle the collaboration that needs to happen, or that maybe you get a no sometimes. And that if that's leaving you feeling broken or inadequate, that's not helping your sex life. Okay. The next myth is that men always want more sex than women, or that men are always ready to go, right? Our culture puts a lot of pressure on men to be sexual. And we can have this idea that guys, have sex on their mind all the time, and that they don't need any stimulation. If you want sex, they're just ready to show up at the drop of a hat. But that is a myth. Now, it works that way for some people for some times, but not everybody all the time. So if you have that idea, either about yourself or about your partner, right, that's putting undue pressure on you, and it sets you up to think that something's wrong. Maybe somebody's broken. And again, that's a major killer for your sex life. So that is a myth. Men can struggle with desire just as much as women. Men can need stimulation and eroticism and arousal and foreplay just as much as women. It's not a problem. So wrap your head around that one. Hey, I'm just taking a quick little break in the middle of the show. Most of you probably know, if you've been listening at all, that I have written a new book called Sex Without Stress. But what you may not know is that I have developed an online course to support you through the process. The book has a lot in it. It's a do-it-yourself process to totally transform your sex life, but it's hard to do it. And it's hard to do it alone without support. So I have been looking for a way to create an environment that's supportive and could help you actually get this stuff done. So what I've done is create an 8-week course. There are webinars that you can watch live or you can watch later There's materials, there are exercises and directions, and then I'm going to offer live online office hours. This is where you can get questions answered and get input on your situation. It's not therapy, but it's a place to come and help you move through the process. The next cohort starts January 28th, 2019, taking enrollment all the way up until then. You can learn more at sexwithoutstress.com. Easy to find the online course information there if you want some more information. I would love to have you join me. Okay, this myth, this one I tackle with almost every couple I have. So it's a myth that you should feel spontaneous desire for sex or that you should feel horny. Okay, so there are basically two ways to experience sexual desire, the way I describe it. Okay, one of them is proactive. That's the spontaneous desire. Those are the people, if you have proactive desire, sex is on your mind, you might fantasize, you get spontaneously interested or aroused. You would like to make sex happen, seek it out, right? That's proactive desire. That is what we think about as libido or sex drive. But that's not the only way to experience sexual desire. The other way is what I call reactive. That's desire that needs to be evoked. Okay? The people with reactive desire may never think about sex or rarely, if ever, get spontaneously interested. They don't fantasize. I mean, I've had people in my office say, I could go the whole rest of my life without sex and be just fine. But for most of those people, if they get what they need, if things are good in the relationship and the stage is sort of set, or if they start, kissing and touching or massaging or even talking and have enough time and space to shift gears, they start to respond, right? You're making out, you're kissing a little bit, oh, wait, the juices are flowing a little bit. You start to get aroused. Your body starts to react. It's like, well, now I want sex. That's reactive desire. It's in response to stimulation or stimuli. It is a totally valid way of being. There's nothing broken with this, okay? But it requires the willingness to start. It needs an opportunity to arise. It needs stuff to respond to react to, right? So both people need to understand that nothing is broken around this, but you have to accommodate it. So it means saying maybe instead of just no, right? You have to enter these encounters maybe from cold, right? From zero, and give yourself the chance to get going. Now, no guarantee. It's not like you can, it's not a full yes because you don't know if you're going to actually end up interested in sex. But if you enter into these encounters and you give it a try, some percentage of the time you're going to respond and you're going to actually want sex where, you maybe couldn't have imagined it 10 minutes before. So it's important to realize that at least one of you might have reactive desire and it requires sort of a different approach to sex. And then once the fire gets going, both people have desire, and that's when you should sort of start the clock, I guess, in terms of recognizing that you've got sexual desire. So very important concept, something I cover with most of my clients. Another myth is sex is natural. It shouldn't take any work. If we're having to work on our sex life or we're having struggles, something must be wrong. This is a myth. It's almost inevitable that in a long-term relationship, you're going to struggle with sex somehow. Because, not only do we have, the desire issues and the relationship issues and all that, but, we're aging, for one thing. We get busy with, maybe children or careers, diseases, happen, things get stuck in the spokes, right? We have these bumps in the road that are going to have sexual effects. At the very least, just busyness and overwhelm happen. And this creates sexual struggle. So totally normal to need to work on your sex life. Totally normal to struggle with sex. I can't say that enough. So just the fact that you're having problems does not mean something's broken. I mean, it sucks, right? It doesn't feel good to be having problems, but that's normal. It's a normal phase. So we go through phases where we have to work at things and transform and grow. Then we get to coast for a while until the next time we have to work on things. That's a natural cycle. So don't feel bad if you're struggling. Similar to that is the myth that you and your partner should know what the other person wants. We shouldn't have to communicate about it. If my partner was really attuned to me, they would just know. Okay, myth. You do need to communicate. There is nobody better than you to know how things are feeling, to know what you want, or to be able to figure that out anyway, and then to communicate that information to your partner so they can be an effective lover for you. They shouldn't just know. It's not their job to just produce this, this perfect touch for you. It's your job to be responsible for that and to communicate it. It's a gift to give each other the detailed information, feedback, and even instruction so that you can be pleasing to your partner. So this idea that somehow our partner should just know, I shouldn't have to talk about it. This is, this magical connection that we have, that is a myth. So please let that one go. Be actively involved in partnership with each other. That's how things are going to go better. The next myth is the idea that women should orgasm just from penetrative sex, from intercourse. This is so prevalent, this idea. So sort of back to the idea of porn, this is almost all you see. But not even just porn, TVs, movies, what you see, you never see anything but women seeming to love intercourse and penetrative sex. In heterosexual relationships, right? But it's a minority of women, maybe as low as 4%, but certainly as low as 25%, that can orgasm just from the stimulation that comes with penetration. Minority of women. Let me say that again. Most women need additional stimulation of their clitoris through some sort of manual stimulation, through positioning that rubs the clitoris, through using a vibrator, whatever it is. They need outer stimulation to get to an orgasm. So that's not what we see in the mainstream media or pornography. It's not talked about it much, certainly not talked about in sex ed. I don't think they mention clitoris. It's really important to understand that nothing is broken if that's the way it's going for you and or your partner. Okay? So if you might have that expectation of, if you're a woman with a clitoris or a vagina, you might have this expectation of yourself that I'm supposed to be having an orgasm this way. What's broken with me? Or if your partner's a woman like this, you might feel something's broken with them, but you might also have this pressure on yourself. Like, I should be able to create an orgasm in my partner through this, and it's not working. And it's because that's a myth. So please let that one go. Likewise, we need to let go of the myth that men should last a long time. Rapid ejaculation or premature ejaculation is somewhat based on subjective desire. The idea that the man's reaching orgasm quicker than they want to. But I get couples coming in and thinking, I can only go like 5 or 10 minutes. So that's premature ejaculation. The reality is, the research shows that more than half of men would orgasm within 2 minutes of thrusting. That's a lot of stimulation. So I want you to understand, I want you to have some concept or perspective about what average is. Now, it is possible to learn to control ejaculation more, to develop an ability to play with the pacing and hold off. And it's possible to learn to orgasm without ejaculation, which then allows you to retain an erection. But that's all going to take some practice. It's going to take some partnership, like alliance with your partner. And it's going to take letting go of the pressure and that expectation so you can develop that capacity over time. But in the meantime, I want you to realize that most men are going to orgasm much more quickly than we think, and that's not broken. And again, you might want to change the situation and you might want to work together to do that, but it's not because somebody's flawed or broken. That's just setting you up again for feelings of failure. The last myth I want to talk about in this episode is the idea that if you're in a good sexual relationship, neither one of you should masturbate. This is apples and oranges. Okay, solo sex is a totally different experience than sex with a partner. You don't have to think about anybody but yourself. You can get lost in your own thoughts. It's simpler. Now, it's not always quicker. Like, sometimes people are just sort of having a real quick orgasmic experience. Other times people are really taking a long time and having a very sensual, sort of slow encounter with themselves. Either one is fine, but it's different than when you're collaborating with a partner in a shared experience. There's nothing wrong with that. Plenty of people in a great sexual relationship still masturbate. There's room for that. So it's not cheating. It's not a problem. Now, it can be used to escape the issues in your relationship. So if you are masturbating instead of having sex with your partner, or instead of tackling the challenges with your partner, you're sort of taking the pressure off so you don't have to deal with it with them. That's a problem. That's avoidance, right? And we'll be talking about that later on another episode about avoidance and dealing with communicating with your partner about that. But as long as it's in addition to your sex life, no problem. Okay, don't think something's broken about that. It can be a great way for the person that has more sexual energy to use some of that up. It can be a great way to learn more about your pleasure and responsiveness so that you can share that with a partner. And it can actually be used with your partner. I would still consider it sex. If one of you is masturbating and the other person is totally present and maybe even helping a little bit, like this is a way to augment what the two of you are doing together. So that's my overview of the most common sexual myths and a little bit of talk about where else you might have gotten expectations about sex. And it's important because this is what sets your idea about how sex is supposed to go and whether you are, air quotes here, succeeding or not. So please examine your expectations. Let go of the ones that are not serving you. See if you can change your mindset about this. It's going to make a big difference in your satisfaction with your partner. Hey, we have another listener question this week. I love doing this. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that on my website, bettersexpodcast.com, at the bottom of every page, you will see a little widget where you can record a question for me. These are anonymous, and if you record a question, I may very well answer it on a future episode. So please feel free to submit them, and I hope you learn from this one.
How do you get intimate with your partner and reconnect when you've drifted so far apart that there's an awkwardness between the two of you, kind of like a wall's up, and you don't know how to break through to that? So sex just seems awkward to even have or suggest.
Well, that's a really great question. And it's certainly something that shows up in therapy all the time. Right, I'm working with people who have been avoiding sex, and it has certainly gotten awkward and so far out of the norm of how they interact that it seems like, how do we go back there? So I would say that the first thing to do is to talk about it, right? To have a conversation where you're coming from a very positive place. I want our relationship to be as good as it possibly can be. And this is not going to be news to your partner that this is awkward and the elephant in the room, right? So you say, we haven't been having sex. We've lost our intimate connection. I really want to get that back. I would like to work with you on this in some sort of fashion, and we can go slow. It doesn't have to be the deep end of the pool, but I would really like us to start to talk about what's happening and to start to do something about it, right? So you start with this conversation where you acknowledge what's been going on. And I almost think that that's the hardest part, because part of what we're avoiding when it's gotten like this is avoiding talking about it. So once you're talking about it, and you might need to be persistent, right? Don't just bring it up once and then go quiet again. Then it's a matter of starting to engage with each other in small ways. I don't necessarily recommend you just go jump into bed and have sex. I mean, some people, maybe that works, but it seems like the deep end of the pool to me. So I would recommend starting with, what's the first step the two of you could take? Maybe going to bed naked would be a big, a reasonable first step. Maybe that's already not happening. Or cuddling, or taking a shower together. Maybe you go to back scratches or more sensual massages. Something that has no pressure, no outcome, no expectation of sex itself, but some way that you reintroduce physical touch and intimacy. And then you can build from there. So the idea that you're going to take it slow, that we're going to get comfortable, we're going to sort of earn back our comfort with each other and overcome that awkwardness. The other thing I often use is a touching exercise where you take, 5 or 10 minute turns One of you is giving, one of you is receiving. The receiver's in charge. This is all described in my book in a lot of detail, but to just give you an overview, the receiver's in charge and you're asking for some sort of physical touch that you would like, and you're instructing the whole time, you're directing it. But no pressure. Does not need to be sexual. It certainly doesn't have to be arousing. You're just introducing some sort of touch. So you might want your hair brushed or a foot rub or a back scratch or, or maybe it's some sort of sexual touch, but no expectation. So when the alarm goes off, you just stop and you switch. So you may have to wrap your mind around the idea that there's no goal to this, but it gives you a place to practice being physically intimate again. And because it's an exercise, it's so different than the way sex goes that it can help you sort of come at it from a new angle. So you're not in the same rut of the way we used to do sex, right? This is so different than what we used to do that maybe it's a safe place to sort of touch and explore and gradually add back physical touch. I hope that's helpful.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.